What's up? It's your brother. And hopefully your friend Big Hill. Rockwacey in the building. Black African Power. Each one teach one. Check this out, man. I'm going to share some information with y'all out of this book right here, Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery by Dr. Naim Akbar. In this book, dude makes the connection between our behavior as a people and the psychopathology that governs our behavior. And he shows us in detail in this book where a lot of our behaviors come from. You know, he takes certain things and he writes about it, and then he makes the correlation between the historic aspect of the slave and our relationship to what he's writing about today. And I think it's excellent. And what I'm going to read to y'all is a portion of this book concerning property. Because I travel this country, right? And one thing that I noticed that when I'm in these enclaves of white communities, or I'm out in white America in the country, you know, even though we bought these people out of the dark ages and we taught them cleanliness, they keep their communities cleaner than ours. Every time that I run, you know, out there, I always notice how clean and stuff it is. Even their trailer parks, their ghettos, their trailer parks have a certain upkeep. You know what I'm saying? It has a certain, you could tell that the people who live there take care of the place. And then you contrast that when I come into inner cities in America and come into the black communities, I see blight, you know, ran down, property value low, vandalism, graffiti everywhere, trash everywhere. And I used to always wonder about that, man. I used to always wonder, man, you know, I always say, you know, niggas can tear the stink off of shit. You know what I'm saying? And I always wondered, like, I've seen certain instances where certain projects was closed down, right? Like when I was living in Memphis, they closed down certain projects or housing projects, and they give the people who live there vouchers. And these people end up in other apartment complexes throughout the city. And these apartment complexes, particularly one that I live in, started looking like the projects because these people bought that ghetto mentality to the new community. And over a period of time, a year or two, this community started looking like the place where they came from. Then the people who live there, who basically probably, you know, just poor working folk, working class people, move out and try to move their people to somewhere better because of what's going on. And Dr. Naim Akbar, he explains it. You know, I always wondered why black folks is like that, and what I'm going to read to you, he clearly explains why we're like that. So I'm going to go through this information right quick. And it's titled Property. You know, our psychopathology to property and its origin in slavery. Because most of our behavior as a people has its origin in slavery. You know what I'm saying? Folks don't want to admit that slavery, that was years ago. But you don't understand, we have the genetic memory of our ancestors. We have the epigenetics of our ancestors. And we have the psycho memory. The pathologies attached to slavery. Just off the subject, whipping our children, I call that a remnant of the plantation. Because that's not how it was done before we were enslaved. So anyway, it says property. It says the slave was permitted to own nothing or very little. Certainly property and the finer material objects such as clothes, jewelry, etc. reserved for the slave master. Douglas writes, I don't know if that's Fred, no, this was some author in 1970. I think it's Frederick Douglass, though, because the book was written in 1970. Yeah, this is Frederick Douglass. Douglass writes, the yearly allowance of clothing for the slaves on this plantation consisted of 2 tow linen shirts, such linen as the coarsest crash towels were made of, 1 pair of trousers, and a jacket of woolen most slazily put together. For winter, 1 pair of yarn stockings and 1 pair of shoes of the coarsest description. The slaves' entire apparel could not have cost more than $8 per year. The allowance of food and clothing for the little children was committed to their mothers, or to the older slave woman having care of them. Children who were unable to work in the field had neither shoes, stockings, jackets, nor trousers given them. Their clothing consisted of 2 coarse towel linen shirts, already described, per year, and when these failed them, as they often did, they went naked until the next allowance day. So what Douglas basically said there is, man, that they give the slaves 1 pair of clothes to a year, and when them clothes is gone, shit, you just go out to make do. It says the slave master's fine house, beautiful landscape, and exquisite clothes and objects were associated with his power and status. This is Dr. Naim Akbar writing. That was just an excerpt of Douglas describing what the slave was issued. So now I'm back to Dr. Akbar's writing. It says the slave master's fine house, beautiful landscaping, and exquisite clothes and objects were associated with his power and status. In the same way that the slave looked upon his master with hatred and resentment, he also resented and envied the master's possessions, because those possessions were associated with freedom and the power to direct one's life, family, and community. African Americans had the slavery influence of mixed attitudes toward material objects and property. On one hand, those objects are still associated with the master and his powers. Therefore, there's a tendency to resent property and take a secret, quote-unquote, unconscious delight in attacking it. Certainly, some of our tendencies toward vandalism and abuse of property have their origin in these experiences with property. Property is still viewed as belonging to the master and not to the slave. So right there, he just told us, man, that, you know, most of us have a mixed attitude. You know what I'm saying? And the first part of that attitude is our resentment towards property. Our resentment toward things, you know what I'm saying? Because we have that psychopathology that the things that we don't own belong to the slave master. So the genetic memory of our ancestors, I would assume, is at work in that dynamic. You know what I'm saying? That the other expression of our attitude, it says this finds additional expression when the African American is thrown into public housing and rented properties, which are in fact still owned by the descendants of the slave masters. Vandalism is unconsciously gratifying in that it acts out the long present resentment of the master's property. Given the persisting dependence on the master, it is safer to be neglectful of his property than overtly hostile towards him. On the other hand, slavery produced a natural and unnatural attraction to material objects. The cast-off hat or dress passed down from the big house to the cabin became a symbol of pride and status. By wearing Master's old hat and Mrs. old dress, one could play at being Master or Mrs. for a few fanciful moments. An illustration of this idea dating back to slavery experiences also come from this author named Stamp, written in 1956. But before I read that, I want to say that this part explains what I was talking about before I started reading. How when black folks move into a property, they vandalize it and tear it up. It says vandalism is unconsciously gratifying that it acts out the long present resentment of the master's property. That's epigenetics. That's genetic memory. That's the genetic memory of our ancestors acting out in our present day behavior. You know what I'm saying? They resented the fact that, you know, they were being oppressed by this dude, by these folk, and, you know, he living up there in the big house, rolling out to church on Sunday, yet you in here raping the children, you raping the women, and some of them raping the men. You done killed my son, you done snatched the babies out my sister's and sold him, my sister's son and sold him, or my son and sold him. So we got a lot of genetic memory of those type of things happening to our ancestors. And when it comes to his property, like it says that given the persistence depended on the master. See, the slaves needed the master, as a lot of us, we need to live in these places. You know what I'm saying? If you are somebody on government assistance, you need those SSI checks and them welfare checks. If you are employed, you need that paycheck from that corporate plantation. So that genetic memory acts out of the fact that, you know, it's easier to damage the property than to go fuck him up for being an oppressor. You know what I mean? Because we know if we do that, the consequence is going to be something that we don't want. So we attack the property. Basically, that's my interpretation of what dude right. You can come up with your own. Now, an illustration of this idea dating back to slavery experiences also comes from stamps. The elegantly dressed slaves who promenaded the streets of southern towns and cities on Sundays. The men in fine linen, the bright waistcoats, the women in full petticoats and silk gowns were usually domestic servants of wealthy planters and townspeople. Butlers, coachmen, and maids and valets had to uphold the prestige of their white families. You know, so right there he talking about why black folk get dressed up and strut around. You know what I'm saying? Because you got to realize that we come from a people who had nothing. So the moment we are able to acquire some property, we want to make sure everybody know. That's why you got people when they get an income tax check of $1,000, $1,500, $2,000, they quick to flash it. You get somebody, man, who ain't used to having nothing, they get a few $1,000 or $1,000 bills, they got to take a picture of it and flash it. That's that psychogenetic memory at work. Also, I remember Roots. Remember when, you know, like dude was talking about how you are given something from the slave master and you take pride in it because you know it came from him. If you remember Roots and Chicken George, when Master Tom Moe made Chicken George the head cockfighter and he took over from the other dude, which was Scatman Crothers, right? Dude gave him his hat. Just an old, dusty, rusty-ass hat that slave probably got from his slave master. So when he gave it to Chicken George, dude, man, tilted it, took it on, and took big pride in having this old, rusty, dusty cap. Why? Because he knew it was passed down. And that was a symbol of being somebody. You know, you a slave. You oppressed. So when he gave you that hat, I'm somebody now. And I see that, man, play out with us as a people when we strut around, you know. And I've been guilty of it. I've been guilty, but I don't do it no more, you know what I'm saying? Because my value and my worth is not attached to anything outside of myself. So if I get dressed up, it's probably because I'm going somewhere and the dress code requires that. It ain't because I'm strutting and want everybody to see like I used to. You know, I'd go buy me a pair of Jordans and make sure you knew I had on some motherfucking $100, $150 tennis shoes. No. And I'm not like that no more, man, because like I say, my worth and my value is not an external dynamic, it's intrinsic, it's internal. So now, back to this property and our attitudes toward it. It says these material objects or dregs of property, like that hat, became equated in the African Americans' thinking with full power and freedom and self-determination which the master enjoyed. We can observe a similar pattern in our developing children who play at being mama and daddy by putting objects of their clothing or other objects associated with them. The legacy of such experience with property and materials have made these objects powerfully influential in the lives of many African Americans. Large sums of money are thrown away yearly on expensive fancy clothes and cars. Uncomfortable, impractical, and showy items of furniture drain our budgets and fail to satisfy our longings because of this persistent wish to look like the slave master. Many of our judgments about people and their worth are disproportionately determined by what these people own or wear. We spend great energy and wealth acquiring these objects associated with power rather than real human social, political, and economic power. There's a frequent tendency to confuse tokens of power with genuine power based upon the slavery experience. It is not unusual for concerned efforts to obtain real political and economic powers to be prematurely aborted by a strategic dispensation of tokens. Realistically assertive efforts to alter social structures have equitably accommodate. America's former slaves have frequently been terminated by offering limited material goods to the major strategists and the movement dies. Sellouts. You know what I'm saying? As soon as we get some power, as soon as we get some momentum, some political or economic momentum, the leaders of these movements are bought out by the white man, a la Jesse Jackson, a la Al Sharpton, and some say Louis Farrakhan. The major thinkers and scholars, potentially our most powerful agents of change in African American communities, are often neutralized by pittance of material goods. This socially destructive phenomenon has its roots deeply in the slavery experience. Too often, the leaders in our communities have equated a small trinket of material gain with having arrived. You know, I got a house in the suburbs and a Cadillac and a job in the corporate structure. I done made it. That's the mind state of the slave. It's a house nigga mentality. That leadership is soon lost to the African American community. It has a recurrence in the old image of wearing massa's discarded hat and thinking that you are massa. It is important that we caution the reader in considering these ideas, that we remember these factors are only one aspect of what determine our behavior. The destructiveness and violence in the American society present mentality fosters vandalism. The materialism which has overrun the Western mind certainly has had its effect on the African American mind. We simply want to be aware of the predispositions which operate from within us and from our past, which may influence us in ways which we do not realize. And I think that's the most important part. That's the drive home piece right there. We simply want to be aware of the predispositions which operate from within us and from our past, which may influence us in ways which we don't realize. You know what I'm saying? That's the reason why, man, I'm sharing this information, because I've learned that I have pathologies. I've learned that things that's happened to me in the past that influences my behavior now. I've learned that there's genetic memory at work in me, that I have some of the things that I do are directly associated with my ancestors that were in slavery. That's genetic memory. It's coded in my DNA. You don't believe me? Just research it. I have. And my purpose for reading this, man, is to share this, to get, you know, the rest of my brothers and sisters to understand, man, that once we understand our behaviors and we take a good look at them, understand where they came from and address the root causes of these behaviors, we can change the behavior and we can go on and be healthy people. And as I always say, better for each other. You know what I'm saying? We'll stop tearing up our damn properties and start buying the hood and taking care of these places and make these places where we live better places to live once we realize where this destructive nature of tearing shit up comes from. But anyway, man, before I start rambling, I just wanted to share that information with y'all and hope that, man, you know, it gives you some insight on us as a people. And, you know, you could take the information and pass it on to your brother and share it with other people to help them understand, you know, where their predisposition, as the doctor said, comes from, where this behavior comes from. Peace. I'm out.